land. But this time, he's got that same rod. And he said, must we fetch water out of this rock? How hard is it to completely trust God? Do we have to help him? Amen. Does he need our help today? Listen explicitly to his words. Disobedience is not a little thing. Amen. Disobedience is not a little thing. It wasn't much disobedience in the Garden of Eden. It wasn't a flagrant sin. It was just simply that they decided that God didn't know what he was talking about. That they could eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they would be just as smart as God. They would be wise. I see people that think that they are just as smart as God. Some of them are preachers, some of them are pew sitters. But let me tell you right now, none of us are ever going to be as smart as God. If I could eat of that tree of knowledge, then I could have the glory that God has. In the book of Isaiah, the Bible said that I am the Lord, my glory will I not share with another. Are we servants or masters? Is God God or are we God? Is he like a vending machine that we go to and we just pull the lever and God's got to do what we say, right or wrong? Moses gave a partial obedience. I see that out of a lot of people today. He took a rod just like he was commanded, but then he used that rod for his own glory. He used that rod for we going to fetch water. Isn't God gracious to even allow him to have water that day? But God allowed him to, even in disobedience, God allowed him to bring water for the people. It wasn't misunderstood. Amen. Moses didn't do that by mistake. You don't misunderstand God's directions. When God tells us what we need to do as New Testament Christians, he's gave it to us plainly. We have a more sure word of prophecy than if we had some prophet standing here telling us. We've got it here written down in a book. Whenever it's written, it's permanent. A sure word of prophecy. And the people can never get by without the grace of God. The grace of God is how I'm standing here today. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be able to even stand here. Moses' grace, he was a meek person, but Moses failed them. It wasn't really Moses' rod. It was God's rod. A rod from before the Lord is what it said in the book of Exodus. It was the resurrection rod. Amen. That budded and blossomed. Grace doesn't smite. The law kills. But grace makes alive. The Spirit gives us life. And back in Exodus chapter 17, Moses was alone. In Numbers chapter 20, Aaron's along with him there. And they both together, I'm assuming, must we fetch water out of this rock. And then I think about the rebellion of a man named Korah. 250 that were consumed because they thought, presumably, that they knew as much as God knew. That the man that God put in charge, they thought that they could do a better job, amen, than Moses could. A congregation grumbled, and you have killed God's people, is what it said. God said, I'll get them. I'll get them while I'm at it. And he got them. Aaron took his incense and ran into the crowd and stood between the living and the dead. Held up that rod, Now he's acting by grace. Now his grace is turned to lasciviousness with Moses abusing that rod of God. Jude chapter 1 says that, doesn't it? Water came out. The mistake of the preacher did not hinder the grace of God. Amen. I don't claim to be infallible, and I don't claim that everything that I do claim that everything to my knowledge that I preach is true, but I don't claim to be infallible. But just because I'm infallible doesn't mean that God, or fallible doesn't mean that God can't feed you if you'll listen, if you'll drink from the water of the fountain of life. Paul said something that Moses could have used. He said, I am what I am by the grace of God. Moses really gets in the flesh. Have you ever did that? Have you ever got in the flesh and took things into your own hands? Smote the rock twice? It's like two vines. There's two kinds of vines. There's two kinds of anger. You know, the new Bibles make a liar out of Jesus, because the new Bibles say if you anger, you sin. Well, Jesus was angry. Amen. I'm glad I've got an old Bible that teaches there's two kinds of anger. There's one that's a righteous anger that Jesus had when he, in anger, took a whip and drove those money changers out of the temple. Then there's another anger that's my anger, and most of the time it's not in the will of God. Most of the time it's Randall in a fleshly anger. And so I'm thinking, in fleshly anger, Moses said, must we smite this rock and bring water for you? When Moses came down Sinai with the 2 tables of stone, he had a righteous anger when he found the people of Israel worshiping the golden calf. But at the rock here today, Moses' error of anger is dishonoring God, not doing what God told him to do. I pray that I'll not misrepresent God. Would you do that? Would you pray that neither me nor my church people would misrepresent God? Now, if you'll bear with me just a few moments, I want to give you a list of things that Moses did that's attributed there when smiting that rock. Number 1, he disobeyed God. That's not what God told him to do. And you know, rebellion against God is the same as if you practiced witchcraft. Same thing that kept Saul out of the kingdom. Amen. Moses from the promised land. Yesterday's obedience can't produce can't protect today's disobedience. Amen. God doesn't do it the same time every time. God doesn't give us the same instructions every time. And we need to have our ears open to what God has to say. He spake out of turn. He's talking when he should have been listening. James says that their tongue is an unruly evil. I remember old Billy Kelly, a lady came to him and said, "Preacher, I've been a gossiping in the church," and said, "I'd like to lay my tongue on the altar." And old Preacher Kelly said, "Well, it's only 10 foot long. Lay what you can." An unruly evil. In Psalm 106, Moses spake unadvisedly with his lips. Moses did not speak in righteous indignation. Jesus did, but Moses didn't that time. And so he is speaking out of turn. Sometimes you'd be better off just keep your mouth shut. Amen. I'd be better off if I just kept my mouth shut. Amen. Not only that, he dishonored God. We can't do anything without God's help, without the grace. We are to esteem our brother better than ourselves. We are to let alone God. We can't do well to admonish our brother, let alone tell God what he needs to do. Job tried that. That didn't work. Do nothing, is said, through strife and vainglory, dishonor God. And Moses was guilty of unbelief. Are you ever been guilty of unbelief? Had he believed God, all he had to done was spoke to the rock. That's what God told him. His lack of faith is a big problem for Moses. It kept him out of the promised land. Our lack of faith today is a big problem in our life. Amen. A father brought his son to Jesus and said, I tried to get you disciples to cast this devil out of him, but they couldn't do it. And Jesus cast the devil out, and they said, why couldn't we do it? And he said, because of your unbelief. In Mark chapter 9, he said, he that believes all things are possible to him that believeth. In 9:24, the man came to Jesus and said, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Have you ever been there? Have you ever said, Lord, I see your promises and I believe your promises, but Lord, help my unbelief of your promises. Moses had a long record of faithfulness, yet he failed. We don't get to be spiritual, so spiritual that we aren't in danger of falling. I mean, I've seen bigger preachers than me hit the dirt. I've seen Christians that were better Christians than you that are no longer here. The indictment of Romans 1 applies to America. We've become people of a reprobate mind. We have just gone after the way of Balaam so much. Romans 2 and Galatians 6. Failures. Moses was a failure. David was a failure. Saul was a failure. Samson was a failure. Jimmy Swaggart was a failure. Jim Baker was a failure. Are we better? Amen. Listen, we need to learn from this. It was serious enough to keep Moses out of the promised land. And I think it would be serious enough to keep us from ever enjoying our Christian life. Sometimes God works with us and works with us and works with us. Finally says, okay, that's what you want to do. You go ahead. And what happens, we'll live to regret it. Thank God it don't keep us out of heaven. Amen. But it will keep us out of the promised land. Let's bow for prayer.